Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here and to be co-creating and dreaming the new earth together. I am super excited for this gathering that is opening today with so many incredible, extraordinary speakers. And yeah, I trust that you're going to be enjoying this week as much as I did creating this event for you. And in this session, I'm going to be sharing about something that I'm really passionate about. And first, we're going to open up with creating a sacred container, just creating something that is going to hold us throughout this week and opening sacred space. So I'm going to take a moment to light some smudge as well first. To burn some beautiful copal and frankincense resin and some herbs. And may this reach all of you, every part of the world, wherever you are. It's beautiful. Sacred energy that we receive from these beautiful natural elements. So with this, we're opening sacred space for this container that you'll be immersed in throughout this week of dreaming the new earth together. And we honor and acknowledge the land and the first peoples and custodians of this place where I am, in the Garden Route, the Garden of Eden in South Africa, honoring all those who came before us, that were part of these landscapes, human and more than human, all the elements, all of the elementals and all the creatures that live and that once lived on this land. Acknowledging and honoring also the lands of all those who are presenting during this week's sessions, and the lands of all of you who are present here from around the world, viewing this and listening. All one land, Mother Earth. And we all each call in our allies in the subtle realms, the ancestors, the guides, the spirit beings who are well and whole and in balance, those who have our highest good at heart, supporting us on our journey to hold a strong energetic container and sacred space for our learning experience and our expansion. May the seeds planted in our minds and our hearts during this week grow into sacred action for our individual and our collective good. And I'd like to call in the directions while you tune in also to those allies and those spirit beings that are part of your support. We call in the direction of the south, calling forth the power of water, and Hatunamaru, great serpent, the mother of the waters. We flow with the tides of life. Gift us your power, soften us, and surround us with love and compassion. We call in the west, calling forth the power of earth. Great jaguar of light, guide us on our journey through the three worlds. We plant ourselves in fertile soil. Gift us your power, ground us, sustain us, and root us. We call in the north, calling forth the power of fire, divine hummingbird, prince of the rainbow. We dance in the iridescent cosmic fire. Gift us your wisdom, transform us, awaken us, and may we shine bright. We call in the east, calling forth the power of air, of the royal condor, sacred eagle. We fly high with powerful wings. Guide us to bring healing to all nations. Inspire us, teach us, and grant us vision. We kneel down on the earth, calling the Great Mother, the spirit of the elements, the wisdom of the dragons, the guidance of all the guardians, to all the Apus, the spirit of the mountains. Gift us your strength. We pray for you to be with us. We invoke your healing presence and honor your creative power. Bring us alive with your essence. To Iyat Dixi Wirakocha, great spirit, great mystery, you who are known by many names, but is the one with no name. We thank you for your creation and for our life. To all the stars, the Pleiades, the Southern Cross, the Great Bear, join us in ceremony. Join us in creating this sacred space as we celebrate what we are becoming, as we celebrate the great becoming. And taking a moment of silence to go within, deep within ourselves, tapping into our own essence and the powers within, and just being here for a moment, here and now. Okay. So for those who don't know me yet, I am Clara Nisiri. I'm the founder of Alchemical Dreaming, which weaves together systemic constellations work, the topic of this presentation that you're going to be accompanying me with today. And it weaves together other threads of wisdom, such as dream work and ritual, breath work, to support people in reconnecting with the many layers of being human and coming back into balance and wholeness for our collective evolution and expanding into the most beautiful life we can imagine. And most of my work stems from methods or traditions that are directly of or which honor the indigenous ways and wisdom lineages of my own ancestry, as well as of other earth-based and spiritual traditions. I'm also the creator and producer of this series of wisdom gatherings, Dreaming the New Earth, which offers opportunities to come together as a global community to access new understandings and to elevate our consciousness as we journey forward together as a collective. So in this session, I want to share with you about systemic constellations work, what it is, and how we can benefit from this method. And firstly, I'll speak of systemic constellations and family constellations in general, and then more specifically about nature constellations, how we can use them as a tool to reconnect with all of life, with all aspects and elements of nature, and thus feel more connected to life, which is an essential part of our existence and having the capacity to move forward. So nature constellations are an aspect of the general constellations field. And to understand these, I'll start by explaining the overall method. Okay. So we have to begin with speaking of Bert Hellinger. He started off as a Jesuit priest, spending 16 of his 25 years in the priesthood as a headmaster of a missionary school for Zulu communities in South Africa. And during his time in South Africa, he was exposed to the ways of the Zulu people and their approach to life in community, their attitudes toward family and beliefs, which influenced his later work. And later, he left the religious order and pursued training in psychoanalysis, in Gestalt therapy, and also in neurolinguistic programming. And expanding or extrapolating various aspects of all of these major influences, Hellinger developed the classical family constellation approach in the 1990s, which later developed to what is known as the new or the spiritual constellations. And through keen observation over the many years that he spent in South Africa with the Zulu communities, he saw certain patterns emerge that he called the orders of love. And these are central to his work, which we'll look at a little bit later. But let's start with what are family constellations and what are systemic constellations. You may have heard more often of family constellations, where the focus is on the intricacies of the family system and exploring the dynamics of what has happened within a family system. Systemic constellations look at the broader systems that give shape to our lives, to our communities, organizations, cultures, and so on. So constellations are an alternative therapeutic method that draws on various influences and fields, from elements of family systems therapy, from phenomenology, the beliefs and attitudes to family and community life of the Zulu nation, as we mentioned, as well as quantum physics, for example. It works in a very simple but also very mysterious way, and it is based on a core belief that we have loyalties to our ancestors, which we unconsciously repeat throughout generations and generations of the family line. So a constellation is a way, a tool to find out what is happening in that family system and bringing it to the surface so that it can be seen, to bring that pattern that is unconscious or unseen, which is influencing a particular issue in someone's life, so that it may be seen and shifted. So it really acts as a bridge between those who were involved in the root of the pattern and those affected by the issue now. So it's a very powerful way also to do ancestral healing work. Now, the prototype, let's say, of a classical group family constellation was developed, as we were saying, by Bert Hellinger in the 1990s. What does that look like? Firstly, we have a group of people that come together in a workshop setting, and that is led by a facilitator. And then you have a client who wants to work on a particular issue, something that they're having difficulty with in their life. And everyone else in the group is there to support investigating that person's issue and investigating the root cause of that issue. The facilitator briefly interviews the client, asks some key questions. It's a very brief interview, so as not to go into all the details of the story, just the main crux of the matter. And then the people in the group step into the constellation field, and this can happen in different ways. We can pick them, or they step in if they're feeling the energy of a particular representative or a particular member of the family. And they step in to do just that. They represent family members or the members of an organization, of any system, for the person who has brought that issue. Okay. Usually, a representative for the client themselves is one of the representatives, and then one or more members of that system or family, and also sometimes concepts such as an illness, a feeling, a nation. It could be an object, a particular significant object. And here, emphasis is really placed on perceptive intuition in how the representatives are placed, and also in the subsequent steps of the process. So the representatives start by standing very still and silent without any acting. This is not involved at all. There's no acting, there's no dialoguing or role playing. We have to empty ourselves completely of any thoughts, of any ideas or preconceptions. And the aim here is to tune into the knowing field or the quantum field. And this field refers to what representatives gain access to and from where they receive information about a client's family system. The representatives have very little or no knowledge about who or what they're representing. However, the knowing field is what guides participants to perceive and to articulate feelings and sensations and thoughts that are not their own, but which mirror those of the real family members that they represent. Then the facilitator may ask each representative to briefly report how they feel in a particular position in relation to the other representatives, for example. And the movements and the representatives' feelings and thoughts that arise in the process, they gradually show us what is creating the issue for that client. A deep ancient pattern that needs to be seen so that it doesn't continue repeating, essentially. One of the core beliefs is that what we reject dominates our energy because it is trying to stay hidden. But once it is seen, it no longer needs to be hidden and suppressed in that family system. And it can now make space for creating an entirely new and healthier pattern and dynamic. Being a representative also holds incredible, big, and beautiful medicine. It almost always there's a resonance in the system of the person that's representing with the issue that is being constellated for another person. So the movement that happens in a representative and bringing something to the surface that's been hidden is really powerful for that person as well, that has perhaps no connection whatsoever to the system of that person that they're representing for, but there is something in their own system for them to learn and to bring to the surface and to heal. But we're only experiencing and seeing one aspect of that person that is relevant to the situation. This is not like channeling or being taken over any kind of spirit form. We're allowing something to move through us and connecting only with that aspect of the person that is relevant in that situation. And we're asking the field to show us what needs to come back into balance. And it's all about embracing what is so that there can be shifts. Because if we reject what is, the pattern will persist. So a healing movement is to embrace the entire past of our family system and all of our family members as and who they are. A healing resolution for the issue can generally be achieved after the representatives reposition in a certain way, and after including key members of the system who have perhaps been forgotten or excluded from the family history. And one or two healing sentences can also be spoken out loud. Although sometimes the process concludes without reaching a full resolution, that can also happen if it's not ready to be seen or to be shifted. Now, being in a constellation means experiencing something that is completely outside of our daily human experience. It is mysterious, and we need to get comfortable with being in the unknown and to allow our body and our intuition to really guide us. For decades, this modality has really been successful, greatly successful in helping people create lasting change. So there is definitely something to it. And also, it's worth saying that it's not something that you go for several sessions periodically. Constellations are moving things over a long period of time, generally, shifting energy and, as I was saying, moving things slowly over a period of time around a particular situation. Okay, so let's look at some of the frameworks from which we could understand constellations work, because perhaps we are familiar with certain things and not familiar with constellations, and this can help add to our understanding of this particular work. Constellations are mainly a phenomenological approach. This means that it's based on how we experience things through our sensory awareness, and we focus on what we become aware of through our senses in that moment, what we see, what we feel and taste. And it seeks to understand the outside world as it is interpreted through human consciousness. So we are called to let go of any preconceptions, any thoughts, any ideas, any hypotheses of what we may think is going on, of any intentionality, and rather allow awareness, observation, listening, very attentive listening, and intuition to lead in this context and bring about the new insights through that. So it's truly about developing a keen observation and informed intuition. The frameworks through which we can understand systemic constellations, for example, these are just a few examples. We have the spiritual understanding that we are all connected, all going back to one source, and that there is a mystery present in this work where we can choose to accept that we don't need to know the why or how things work. And when one is facilitating, for example, it is about really observing, also when representing, of course, about observing and allowing a knowing to come through us, and not necessarily from us, but to come through us. Then there's systems theory. The focus of constellations work is on the larger system that an individual is part of, as opposed to an individual. We are part of a family, we're part of organizations, we're part of racial groups, of nations, and so on. Many parts that make up a whole, and there's a continuous communication that's happening between these parts. A system tends toward health and balance for its survival. And if something is excluded from that system, from that organization or that family, this really upsets the balance. There's that understanding as well. And then there are other frameworks within which we can understand it that contribute to our understanding of constellations. And those are, for example, Jung's collective unconscious, epigenetics, and looking at fractals and how resonance works. And we're going to look a bit more into resonance in a moment as well. Okay, so as we were saying before, Hellinger's original work was considered classical constellations, and these happen in the movement of the soul. Now, in this framework, the soul is a level of consciousness that unites and takes care of groups, of families, of clans, of systems in general. And it always seeks balance and compensation. For example, when someone is excluded, the system becomes imbalanced. And when I say excluded, that can mean they were forgotten, they were, ousted from the family for some reason and never spoken of again. That's just one example. So the system becomes imbalanced, and someone is brought in to represent the person in a constellation who was excluded and repeating this person's difficult destiny. So the representatives are connected in the compensation and balance dynamic. Later, in the early 2000s, his work came to a point where Hellinger's work came to a point where he realized there was something much greater at work in the field. So it shifted and it became known as the new or spiritual constellations. Some also call it quantum constellations, which work in with the movement of spirit. And spirit is a higher level of consciousness that encompasses everything and everyone. It's that creative force of pure love that flows and that breathes through everything. What some call God, Source, Great Spirit, the universe, Great Mystery. It doesn't distinguish between good or bad, right or wrong, and it only seeks to find a path toward liberation and toward life. So in the new constellations by Bert Hellinger, all participants, the client, the facilitator, the representatives in a constellation setting, they go deeper to a loving surrender that's connected with the movement of spirit. And the focus is more on the healing movement and on that deeper surrender to what is and to choosing life and moving forward in life. Hellinger speaks of the movement of spirit in his book in the Service of Life. And there's a quote here from that book that says, Aristotle observed that everything in existence is moving. And he observed that this movement couldn't come out of what already exists, that it must come from somewhere else. Thus, he concluded there must be a first mover. The first mover must be something spiritual, for everything that moves does so meaningfully, in accord with many other things that move with it, in meaningful interplay. Everything comes into being because the spiritual power thinks it, because it thinks it and wills it, as it is. It thinks and moves everything creatively. What follows from this? And there's another part that says, it is inconceivable that there could be anything to oppose this creative spirit, or anything the spirit could reject or lose. After all, where could it go other than back to the spirit, back to its source? Beautiful. Okay, let's go on to speaking of a little more in depth about the spiritual and new constellations. In the study of these constellations, we can find an explanation for the field and the movement of spirit by looking at quantum physics. And here we need to mention the work of Rupert Sheldrake and his theories on morphic and morphogenetic fields. Because in that shift that happened in Hellinger's work, his many conversations with Rupert Sheldrake actually were key. And Hellinger incorporated the idea of morphic resonance into his explanation of the movement of spirit. So what are morphic and morphogenetic fields? A morphic field, which we can imagine as, if we want to give it a visual reference of some sort, we can imagine it as a bubble of information that we can access. It's an information field that's created and added to by resonance. And resonance refers not only to physical forms, but also to behaviors, to thoughts, to cultures, collectives, and so on, which vibrate in sympathy with each other. They resonate with each other. So we can think of a morphic field as a habit or a building of energy around something by doing the same thing over and over, as in a family, for example, repeating patterns. Now, to break that down a bit further, in biological terms, a morphogenetic field is, let's say, a blueprint that stores information for how a form of consciousness will manifest and behave. For example, a being of a particular species. the morphogenetic field is going to influence or determine how the subsequent generations of that species are going to be and behave and look and so on. And this is available throughout time and space. These morphogenetic fields help to guide the formation of later systems, as I was saying. A newly formed system will tune into a previous system of the species when it has within it something that resonates with a similar element in that earlier form. We can say, therefore, there's a kind of memory in nature, and each type of every being that exists has a collective memory. For example, a mouse that lives in Paris. That one little mouse is going to be influenced by all past mice everywhere, no matter where they live. And that influence moves through time. So that collective mouse memory, let's call it, both in terms of its form and its instincts and its behaviors, are influenced by this. And this influence is determined by the process that Rupert Sheldrake calls morphic resonance, a theory of collective memory throughout all of nature. It is these fields that shape behaviors and that give order to nature. So this collective memory throughout nature is expressed through the morphic fields, the fields within and around each organism. These fields are what we access in a constellation about a particular system. And in a healing movement, in systemic work, we're breaking that resonance. A beautiful way to illustrate a morphogenetic field is a flock of birds or a school of fish that move perfectly synchronized. I'm sure you've seen that, making the most astonishing forms in the air or in the water. And each individual is moving according to the dynamic of the field that organizes the group and not to their individual brain thought processes, because the speed at which they move and that they shift together, it cannot be based only on thought processes. In quantum theory, we have quantum non-locality, which it refers to when different particles or elements that belong to the same system, if they're separated or there's some distance between them, they remain connected. And when one of them changes, this affects the other parts of the system too. They also change, even though there's a distance between them. So you can see how this can apply to what happens in a family system where generations back, there's a root issue, there's a cause that affects many generations down the line. When it comes to systemic constellations, Hellinger referred to the relation between present and past problems that are not caused by direct personal experience as systemic entanglements. So, as I was saying, a generation in the present that is being affected by an issue that occurred many generations back in their family line is described or explained in systemic constellations through this term of systemic entanglement. This occurs when an unresolved issue has affected a system or family through, a particular impactful event. And it's referred to as a loyalty in that system, as we mentioned earlier on. So now that we have an overview of what, let's say, the mechanics and the science could be behind systemic work, let's go back to what makes up constellations in terms of the basic principles, these powerful principles that work through constellations work. And I say that what the mechanics could be because there's still so much mystery around what they are and how constellations work. And it really is in that greater field, a higher force that we trust and surrender to receive guidance and where balance can be restored when engaging this work. So let's have a look at those principles by which the work is guided. These are patterns that Hellinger observed when this method was being formulated, and they're called the orders of love, as we said, or can also be referred to as the forces of love. And they are mainly four principles, although we could say there are another one or two that are also important, but the main ones, let's look at those. We have inclusion or belonging, the core belief that every single part of the system belongs. We have hierarchy, and not in the sense that we're mostly familiar with this term, as in a power structure, a top-down power structure of some kind, but rather in the sense of honoring the order of in which the parts of that system came into being. For example, in a family, who came before? What is the order in which siblings were born? Which generation comes before? So honoring those who came before us. Then we have acknowledging everything as it is, or yes, opening up to everything as it is without judgment, without attachment to whether something is right or wrong. Just acknowledging that something is as it is without resistance or rejection. Then there's the balance between giving and taking. This is something absolutely important in relationships, as we know. And what happens when these aspects are not in balance? This is what constellation seeks to remedy, to bring these things, if they're out of balance, back into balance. What happens? What does it look like when these aspects are not in balance? When there's an exclusion, for example, and I mentioned a brief example earlier, there could be the death of someone in a past generation who was never spoken of again in the family because of shame or something that person did that was just completely rejected. Perhaps someone who had a mental illness and was committed to an asylum and never spoken of again. It could be an ex-spouse of somebody in the family who was excluded and, rejected from the family. All of this creates an imbalance in the system, and that person must be included again in the system. Now, I'm sure there'll be questions that come up about that. That simply is shown in the constellation itself. It doesn't necessarily mean going to have a conversation with that person if they're still among the living, but just acknowledging that person as part of the system. Not just, it is it is a big healing movement to bring that element, that person, that part of the whole back in. Because all parts of the whole belong. And otherwise, someone in a generation further down can still be unconsciously playing out a pattern and causing issues in their life. Then, when hierarchy isn't respected in a system, for example, when a child takes the place of a parent through just feeling that they need to step up and take care of the parent because there's such a deep love in a child for their parent that they feel they need to save them for some reason. They might be emotionally or physically in trouble of some kind, and a child will often have that feeling that they need to step up and be the parent to that parent. Or a younger sibling takes the place of an older sibling. That's when a person is not in their place in the system or in the order of things. And then unhealthy dynamics emerge from that. What happens when there's no acknowledgement of things as they are? We resist something, we reject what is. This causes a lack of flow. We can be stuck living in the past. We can be reliving or living with entanglements, from the past that still are causing us issues. And the same happens when there's an imbalance of give and take. It causes big issues in any kind of relationship. Okay, so let's move on to nature constellations. Nature constellations As I said earlier, they're an aspect of the greater field of constellations work, and they've been developing over some time now, as it was observed at some point in constellations work that elements of nature really wanted to come through in the field and be given a voice to support family systems in some cases, in many cases. And here we can see similarities with shamanism, how they both work with nature as well as with ritual. Ritual is something that fits into this work very naturally. And the orders of love, these forces of love that we've just been looking at, these principles, they apply in nature constellations too, not only when dealing with human family systems. For example, acknowledgement. In general, we need to acknowledge and include all aspects of nature in a particular situation as part of the whole, or all aspects or parts of any situation that has to do with nature. They could be humans as well, or organizations or corporations, etc. And then acknowledging aspects such as the land is absolutely key. Acknowledging the land and place where a constellation is being held right at the start, before we even begin, and inviting the land there to support the work. Honoring the place of one's birth and the land or lands of one's ancestors, for example. Honoring the land for whatever events have happened there in the past as well. These are all very helpful. We know that there's a hierarchy as well. That's another one of the systemic principles. Earth is the big one. We are the little one. The Earth came into being long before we did. You may have seen the representation of Earth's timeline. If we compared the 4.5 billion years, I think it is, that the Earth is believed to have existed, if we compared that to a 24-hour timeline, humans only appeared just a few seconds before midnight, which is hardly anything compared to what has come before us on this planet. I think it's 4 seconds before midnight that modern humans appeared. So here we also see how the more than human, the creatures of this earth, the plant life, the elements, they're all our ancestors too. I truly believe that. And we're all made up of them. This realization or putting things into perspective like this is something that could support those with eco-grief, for example, the grief and fear around the destruction of our planet. This is a very real thing for many people. As humans, we need to understand our place, and I'm speaking to myself here too. As humans, we need to understand our place in the order of things. We absolutely have responsibilities toward our home planet. There's no doubt. But we must also remember that the Earth is bigger and much, much, much older than us. She came long before us, and we need to trust that she knows much more than we do, even about her own survival. And in that realization, we can gain humility that will really serve us in doing any kind of earth work, of earth-based work, nature work. Then there's the principle of balance between give and take. We receive so much from the earth. Everything we need to survive, we receive from the earth. So reciprocal giving, sacred reciprocity is necessary in our relationship with nature. There must be a balance there and a limit to what we take. There's also, we can speak of cyclical reciprocity, for example, with plants when it comes to oxygen. We use the oxygen and we expel what other beings can use, the earth can use. We can look at it also from the lens of sustainable agriculture, where there's a cyclical receive and give. Through nature constellations, then, we can really be encouraged to be in service and in devotion and truly embody these concepts in a much bigger way. They can become a way of life, a philosophy of life. So as you can see, we can really bring back into balance our family system and find our place in the family of the greater earth, by observing and honoring all of these systemic principles. And here again, we need to remember the different levels of consciousness, as we saw earlier. And in nature constellations, we need to be that hollow bone, completely open to the field and free of any judgments, any thoughts or ideas of how we think things should be. And this can be a challenge in this context because many people have very strong views and even an anxious perspective of what needs to be done, what needs to happen, what the outcomes should be. And we have to remain aware of our preconceptions and empty ourselves, as I was saying, and accept what is arising in the field as it is. Someone could have a very embodied experience of an aspect of nature, and what arises to be felt or to be said could challenge our personal view of that particular being or that particular situation. So these are things to also keep in mind. Let's have a look at what is possible with nature's constellations. The possibilities are incredibly vast with constellations in general and with nature constellations. These are just some examples. We could have a simple yet profound experience of connecting or even communicating with an aspect of nature. We could do a constellation to look at an environmental issue and bring in all the parts involved for a resolution where that's needed. We would bring in the aspects of nature, the human community in relation to it, a company that's involved, activists, and so on. Whatever parts are involved in that situation that needs resolution. We could connect with the land where we were born in a completely new way, with a new awareness, and invite it as a being, as a conscious being, to support us in our life. There's a very deep connection between humans and where we were born, where we came into this existence. Of course, our mothers are such a huge part of that, but the land that saw us come into being is part of that too. We can uncover the cause of an unhealthy state of a particular ecosystem. That is possible too. We can uncover the reason a family may be experiencing difficulties in a particular place or land through giving the nature beings and the land a voice in a constellation. And I can share an example of that. A man who had inherited a farm, a very big piece of land that had been in his family for various generations. He had been trying to make a living from it with sustainable, ethical agriculture and livestock. It seemed he was doing everything the right way. And he had tried for years and years, but nothing seemed to be working. Then he tried to sell it, or sell it in smaller plots, because nobody was interested in buying such a big piece of land. And that was a challenge too. So through a constellation, the family was able to hear the voice of the land, as well as the voice of the indigenous people who had been custodians of the land a long time before, who lived much closer to the land. And what was out of balance was uncovered and addressed in this constellation. Those indigenous ancestors of the land happened to also be part of this man's ancestral line. They were of mixed race, but that identity and the culture had been completely suppressed and even looked down upon over the following generations of the family. So here we can see how intertwined the lives of our human ancestors are with that of the land and aspects of nature as well. And interestingly, it's in these the indigenous histories going back thousands of years that we can find our greatest resource for this kind of work. These histories have been overlooked because they're not science or evidence-based, so-called. But many of those cultures were very aware of what we could learn from having these exchanges we can have in this kind of modality and with all of nature. So this is really a method that can help us grow and expand our view and put aside cultural biases as well and conditioning Many people are still very much conditioned by the belief that humans are in a position of dominance and entitlement over the earth, and everything is considered according to its value for extraction and commerce. So it is important that we be aware of what our conditioning and our constructs are when we engage this work, because it's a perspective that's often very limiting. And we also need to acknowledge that there is much we may not know. And we work with the invisible most of the time. And because it's not necessarily evidence-based, it doesn't mean it's not real. Now, I'd love to share an aspect here that I love working with as well, something that's really beautiful to work with, I believe. And that is the dream time. For me, in my view, stepping into a constellation is akin to being in the dream time, bringing to the surface. They both work in that way of bringing to the surface things that are unconscious. And I'd like to share an example, a personal story actually, since we're speaking of the echoes of the ancestors in the earth's dreaming too. I had a really powerful dream the night that my maternal grandmother died 9 years ago, which has stayed with me ever since. She was in a different time zone, 7 hours behind. So, literally, when I was sleeping and having that dream, she was taking her last breaths. In this dream, I was in some kind of an open space, an indoor space, but it was open and the doors were wide open, the windows were open, and there was a lot of beautiful sunlight coming in, and the outside was a nature setting. And I was singing in the stream, and two little birds came in through the door, flying through the door, attracted by the singing. And they were fluttering around me. And at one point, I lay down on this day bed or something like that. I lay down, still singing, just relaxing, and I had my hands open. And one of those little birds came and nestled in my hand. And they were actually two little robins. They were red-breasted robins. One of these birds came and nestled in my hand. And I will always remember the feeling of that moment in the dream. It was such a heart-opening moment and expansive, and just so much love was exchanged between us. And then, and that's where the dream ends. And in a constellation not long after that, I wanted to look into this dream, and I wanted to look into what that robin had come to share. And I was able to understand that the two birds that had come to visit were my two grandparents, my maternal grandparents. My grandfather had passed many years before, and that one little bird that nestled in my hand was my grandmother, passing on the mantle of certain gifts in my maternal line. It was such a significant dream, and since then I've come to associate my grandmother with a red robin. And every time I see a little robin, my what comes out instinctively is, "Hey, Granny." And I have a moment with her and I speak with her. Interestingly, and this is a side note, a few years later, quite a few years later, I was having a long conversation with a cousin that I'm close with on that side of my family. And she shared with me a dream that she just had. Her elderly mother, my aunt, was in a coma at that time. And in my cousin's dream, her mother had walked into her apartment, and my cousin asked her about our grandmother, who had passed away a few years before and who I had that dream about with the robins. And she asked why had our gran not come with her to to visit. Then my cousin pointed out to her mother a few little birds that were just outside the window singing. And that, of course, immediately reminded me of my dream about my grandmother. And I asked her, what kind of birds were they? Were they perhaps red-breasted robins? And she said yes. And my aunt, she never came out of that coma. She passed away a few weeks later. and joined our grandmother on the other side as ancestors to both of us. So these mysteries are just the most incredible thing to work with. I'd like to share with you a small process that I went through while I was preparing for this presentation, and to share the answer with you in this presentation, I asked the field, I tuned into the field and asked a couple of questions. And for the first question, I was assisted by some cards that I have that are all about family constellations. And I wanted to share the answer with you in this presentation. And the first question, the main one, was what is one of the major lessons that this modality, systemic constellations, has come to assist us with at this time in our evolution? And I had the intention beforehand to draw three cards. And the three cards that emerged in this process are very interesting. And it's never random, as we know when we engage with this kind of work. I've got the three cards here. The first one that came up was money. And I don't know if you can see that there. Money. They're in Spanish, but that's money. Um, the second one was mother. And I'll explain why this is so interesting that these two came out together. I don't know if you can see that there. Yeah, mother. And the third one was guilt. The third one was guilt. Now, the first two, money and mother, are actually so intimately connected. Our connection with money, whether positive or negative, is heavily influenced by our relationship with our mother. This is something that is looked at in family constellations. And we're called to honor this energy as a means that supports us, that helps us develop in different ways. It is an energy that also requires of that principle of, a balance in receiving and giving. And the second card, Mother, who we are called to honor with kindness because, she connects us with the power to love. And she is the big one, and we are the small one in terms of the family order. And we receive everything from her. We receive life force and sustenance from her. And we accept and respect her as our mother. And we need to take our place as her child. And then the third one, that was guilt. By taking responsibility for our actions with love, guilt can disappear from our life. And we can honor guilt, this feeling, this sense that we might carry from something that we've done, or that somebody in our ancestral line did. We could be carrying that guilt as well. And we need to take responsibility and leave that guilt with whom it belongs and be at peace with it. And I feel that I just wanted to offer the three concepts because I feel there's a really deep message for us here related to our connection with Mother Earth. And also I feel related to eco-grief, as I mentioned earlier, especially around guilt. And this is, for us each to sit with and see how we relate to it. Then I also tuned in for an inspiring message. I wanted to share an inspiring message of what is possible with constellations and with our connection with the whole. And I was reminded that this work shows us that there are many viewpoints for one situation, not just our own. That life has hundreds of options and answers to any issue, to any one issue. It also teaches us how to truly listen. This is something that repeats through many of the conversations, many of the interviews, that we slow down and truly listen. And consider what we hear and see and experience in this particular work, so that we can allow ourselves, all these options and opportunities that may be coming our way. For that to happen, we need to allow ourselves to truly listen. Often we have situations in our life where we feel stuck or unable to move forward. Here we can develop the ability to step into life and respond. And that's what responsibility that's here on the slide refers to. Taking responsibility for one's life. And taking responsibility means we can take responsibility for our own life, means we can take responsibility with more confidence for life in a greater sense, life on earth, the lives of our animal kin, of the environment, etc. The small steps that we can take toward bringing balance and coherence into our lives will translate to much bigger ripples in the greater picture. It's our responsibility to find our own answers and to act on them, and not to wait for someone or something else to do that for us. This is what it means to be sovereign beings, to have that ability to respond, response ability. And our future on an individual level and collectively truly depends on it. Many future generations of our species and all other beings on our planet depend on it. We all have that ability in us to respond to life, and we need to learn how to recognize it in us and allow it to act and to be of service. And this is also what it means to find our personal medicine and to share that. Then the third one, in systemic work, we can find clarity and a higher viewpoint of a situation and a renewed sense of direction. And in this, we can also find resources to lean into, like, for example, an ancestor or a spirit guide. With their wisdom and support, our decisions can be reinforced. So stepping into that space of systemic work, into the knowing field, is akin to, also in my view, is akin to dropping into silent sacred space in ceremony, where without any distractions, we can truly see through the mystery and find those answers that we're looking for.